In the twilight of the Second World War, the Pacific Ocean transformed into an arena of unimaginable terror and unprecedented tactical evolution. The United States Navy, a colossal armada of steel, logistical brilliance, and overwhelming industrial might, was relentlessly pushing the Japanese Empire back toward its home islands. The island-hopping campaign had systematically dismantled the outer perimeters of Japan's defensive sphere, culminating in the devastating loss of experienced Japanese aviators during the Marianas Turkey Shoot. Their aircraft carriers were left virtually empty, and their conventional air power evaporated into the Pacific skies. Facing imminent invasion and possessing a military apparatus stripped of its veteran fighters, the Japanese High Command unleashed a weapon born of pure fatalistic desperation. It was a tactical doctrine that defied all logic of traditional warfare, violated the fundamental human instinct for survival, and struck absolute dread into the hearts of American sailors. They called it the Divine Wind, known to history and the terrified gunners of the Allied fleet as the Kamikaze, did to comprehend the sheer panic and existential threat posed by the kamikaze. One must look at the battlefield through the eyes of an anti-aircraft gunner stationed on the exposed deck of an American warship. For decades, naval defense doctrines and anti-aircraft ballistics were built upon a single, unshakable assumption: the enemy pilot wants to survive the engagement. In a standard combat scenario, defensive fire was as much a psychological deterrent as a physical one. A ship would throw a massive wall of lead and flak into the sky, forcing approaching dive bombers and torpedo planes to break their formations, drop their payloads inaccurately out of fear, and retreat to base. The kamikaze stripped away that fundamental rule of self-preservation. Plunging from the clouds, these pilots did not take evasive maneuvers when fired upon. They did not pull up after releasing a bomb. They became the bomb itself, guided by the steady hands of pilots who had already accepted their own deaths. These flying explosives were entirely immune to the psychological deterrence of incoming fire, accelerating directly into the massive steel hulls and wooden flight decks of the American fleet. The physical and psychological devastation inflicted by this new tactic was apocalyptic, beginning in earnest at the Battle of Leyte Gulf in late 1944 and reaching a horrific crescendo during the Battle of Okinawa in the spring of 1945. The skies rained fire upon the Allied Armada. Over 300 United States Navy ships were severely damaged, and dozens of vessels were sent to the bottom of the Pacific, taking nearly 5,000 Allied sailors to watery graves. The sheer kinetic force of a combat aircraft, fully loaded with highly volatile aviation fuel and heavy armor-piercing explosives, slamming into a ship at over 300 miles per hour, was a nightmare naval architects had never fully anticipated. While the heavy, reinforced armor belts of battleships and cruisers could withstand torpedo strikes and conventional bombs below the waterline, this relentless, pinpoint aerial accuracy was tearing the fleet apart from the top down. Kamikazes obliterated wooden flight decks, destroyed critical command and control structures, and sparked raging infernos that consumed ships from within. Faced with this unprecedented onslaught, the United States Navy found itself grappling with a severe crisis of morale and strategy. Fleet commanders and admirals quickly realized that, If they could not find a way to effectively shield their ships from this relentless rain of suicide planes, the planned amphibious invasion of the Japanese mainland Operation Downfall would result in naval casualties so catastrophic they would be politically and militarily unacceptable to the American public. Traditional defense mechanisms were failing because hitting a fast-moving, erratic, and highly motivated target with a direct artillery strike was mathematically improbable. Standard anti-aircraft shells relied on mechanical time fuses, requiring gunners to estimate the exact altitude of the incoming plane and set a timer before firing. If the calculation was off by a fraction of a second, or if the kamikaze pilot slightly altered his throttle, the shell exploded harmlessly in empty sky, leaving the plane untouched to continue its deadly dive. The military didn't just need more guns on their ships. They needed a fundamental paradigm shift in naval defense. They needed technology that could outthink a pilot who was ready to die thousands of miles away from the blood-soaked waters and burning ships of the Pacific Theater. The absolute brightest minds in American science and engineering were already working on the ultimate shield, deep inside the Applied Physics Laboratory at Johns Hopkins University. Operating under the purview of the National Defense Research Committee, a project was underway that was so highly secretive it was classified at the exact same level as the Manhattan Project. The mission assigned to the scientists of Section T was simple in its conceptual phase, but bordered on absolute science fiction in its required execution. If a direct, kinetic hit on a kamikaze plane was nearly impossible using a mechanical timer, the Navy needed an artillery shell that didn't require a direct hit at all. They needed a smart weapon, a munition that possessed a rudimentary mind of its own and could decide the optimal moment to detonate. The solution engineered by these scientists was the VT Proximity Fuze, the VT standing for variable time to obscure its true nature from spies. It was, essentially, a miniaturized, fully functioning radar station packed directly into the nose cone of a 5-inch artillery shell. The genius of the VT fuse was its active tracking capability. It did not rely on timers or physical impact. Instead, as the shell was fired from the barrel of a naval gun, the extreme G-force of the launch shattered a tiny glass vial inside the fuse. This vial contained an electrolyte fluid that instantly washed over a series of plates, creating a wet battery that powered up the internal electronics in milliseconds. Once airborne and armed, the shell began broadcasting a continuous radio signal. When that signal bounced off a solid object, such as the metal fuselage or engine block of an incoming Kamikaze Zero, it reflected back to a receiver inside the shell. Using the Doppler effect, the internal circuitry measured the frequency shift of the returning wave. The moment the frequency shift indicated the enemy plane was within a lethal 70-foot radius, the fuse automatically triggered the explosive charge. It didn't need to physically strike the plane. It only needed to get close enough to surround the incoming pilot with an inescapable, devastating cloud of high-velocity shrapnel, creating a vacuum tube radio system robust enough to survive being shot out of a naval cannon at over 2,000 feet per second. Was a monumental engineering hurdle that many believed was impossible. The violent forces involved often exceeding 20,000 times the force of gravity were enough to instantly crush standard glass electronics into fine powder. The development required unprecedented advancements in ruggedized miniaturization, specialized plastics, and reinforced filaments. This intense wartime research would eventually pave the way for the modern solid-state electronics age. But in the desperate months of 1944 and 1945, it was simply a matter of life and death for the men of the Pacific Fleet. Massive manufacturing efforts were mobilized across the United States, utilizing watchmakers and women on assembly lines to hand-solder the microscopic components with absolute precision. Because the technology was so sensitive, the Navy strictly forbade the use of VT fuses over land for years, terrified that a dud shell might be recovered and reverse-engineered by the Axis powers. While the smart shell was a revolutionary leap in ordnance, it was only one piece of a much larger puzzle. A proximity fuse was entirely useless. If the guns could not be pointed in the general direction of the enemy with rapid accuracy to build an impenetrable wall of fire, the Navy had to reinvent how it managed the sheer chaos of modern combat. As the kamikaze threat evolved, Japanese pilots began adopting low-altitude skimming tactics, flying mere feet above the ocean waves to hide in the clutter of the radar returns and evade early detection. In response, the United States Navy deployed an integrated technological ecosystem that would become the absolute foundation of modern naval warfare. They created the Combat Information Center, universally known as the CIA, and married it to advanced analog computers. Before the invention of the CIC, a warship's defense was highly decentralized and reliant on human vision. The captain or the gunnery officer, standing on the open bridge, looked out over the horizon with binoculars, spotted an incoming plane, and shouted orders down to the gun mounts. Against a single kamikaze, that analog method might suffice. However, against coordinated waves of 50 or 100 suicide planes attacking simultaneously from multiple vectors and altitudes, it was a recipe for absolute slaughter. The human mind simply could not process the variables fast enough. The Combat Information Center solved this by centralizing every single piece of sensory data into one heavily protected room deep within the ship. Radar feeds, sonar pings, visual lookout reports, and radio intercepts were all routed to the CIC inside this dimly lit room, bathed in red light to preserve night vision. Teams of specialized sailors functioned as an organic computer. They marked grease pencils on transparent status boards, tracking friendly and enemy contacts, calculating vectors, and cutting through the fog of war to prioritize the most immediate threats to the vessel. Once the men in the CIC identified and prioritized an incoming kamikaze target, they handed the tracking data off to the Mark 37 fire control system, which remains one of the most incredible technological marvels of the analog age. The system utilized a dedicated radar director mounted high atop the ship to lock onto the specific kamikaze. It then fed that continuous tracking data down into a massive, intricate mechanical computer hidden deep inside the armored bowels of the ship, safely protected from enemy fire. This complex arrangement of spinning dials, interlocking gears, and rotating output shafts instantly calculated a dizzying array of variables. It factored in the target's speed and course, the current wind velocity, the pitch and roll of the ship on the ocean waves, the specific ballistics of the shell being fired, and even the ambient temperature of the gunpowder, which affected muzzle velocity. In real time, the mechanical computer predicted exactly where the kamikaze would be by the time the shell arrived in the sky, automatically swiveling and elevating the ship's massive 5-inch dual-purpose gun turrets to intercept the target with zero human aiming required at the mount itself. When the predictive, automated tracking of the Mark 37 mechanical computer was combined with the proximity detonating VT fuse, the resulting defensive shield was one of unparalleled lethality. The gunners inside the steel turrets no longer had to visually track the target, nor did they have to guess the altitude and manually set mechanical fuses. The radar found the plane, the mechanical computer aimed the gun, the automatic loaders rammed the shells into the breeches, and the smart fuse ensured the kill. The Japanese kamikaze pilots, expecting to weave through a traditional storm of inaccurate mechanical flak, instead found themselves flying blind into an invisible wall of fragmentation. Aircraft were instantly shredded mid-air, their wings sheared off by proximity blasts, their engines destroyed, tumbling violently into the ocean before they could ever reach the vulnerable wooden decks of the aircraft carriers. The tactical results of this technological synthesis were immediate, highly measurable, and staggering. The efficiency of American anti-aircraft fire skyrocketed overnight. Statistical analysis showed that while a standard mechanical time fuse required an average of over 2,000 rounds fired to successfully bring down a single enemy aircraft, the newly deployed VT fuse required only a few hundred. Whole squadrons of kamikazes were obliterated miles away from the center of the fleet. However, the Japanese tactics continued to adapt, leading the Navy to implement one final, harrowing defensive measure: the radar picket system. To give the heavy carriers and battleships even more warning time to spool up their automated defenses and launch fighter interceptors, the Navy began stationing solitary destroyers far out over the horizon, acting as early warning tripwires for the main fleet. These lone radar picket ships took the absolute brunt of the Japanese fury during the prolonged Battle of Okinawa, because they were stationed at the very edges of the American perimeter. They were the first vessels the kamikaze pilots encountered on their one-way flights from Japan. Often, rather than searching for the larger carriers, the Japanese pilots would simply dive on the first American ship they saw. The men aboard these destroyers, such as the famous USS Leyte, endured unimaginably sustained attacks, fighting off swarms of suicide planes for hours on end in isolated, terrifying engagements. They suffered horrific casualties, with decks running red with blood and superstructures melted by burning aviation fuel, earning a reputation for unyielding bravery and resilience. However, their immense sacrifice, coupled with the high-tech firepower of the VT fuses and fire control computers they wielded, bought the precious minutes the main fleet needed to survive the onslaught. The kamikaze campaign remains one of the most terrifying chapters in the history of naval combat. It was a brutal clash between a cultural philosophy of fatalistic sacrifice and an opposing doctrine of overwhelming industrial capacity and scientific innovation. In the end, the ingenuity of American scientists, the logistical power of American factories, and the iron resolve of the sailors who manned the radar screens and gun mounts prevailed over the suicide tactics of the Japanese Empire. The development of the VT Fuze, the organizational triumph of the Combat Information Center, and the precision of automated fire control computers did far more than just shield the Pacific Fleet from the divine wind. They fundamentally revolutionized the mechanics of naval warfare forever. Today, the highly advanced Aegis combat systems, phased array radars, and automated point defense Gatling guns that protect modern warships are the direct, unbroken technological descendants of the analog systems forged in the desperate fires of the Pacific, proving that human innovation, when pushed to the absolute brink of disaster, can build a shield strong enough to withstand the most determined forces of destruction.